so you'll hear a bit more about them, but also how that role impacts on the sharing of misinformation. So Jess, perhaps I can come to you first.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. So my name is Jess Macbeth. I actually work with Southwest Grid, which is one of the partners in the UK Safer Internet Centre, and that's how come I represent the centre in Scotland. So as part of my role with UKSIC, I do lots of work with professionals, training with professionals and parents and young people on the full range, really, of online harms and online safety issues, but that includes media literacy and misinformation. And it's a topic area that I'm really interested and fascinated in. So I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. As part of that role, as I say, so I do training, also create educational materials, do a podcast, and promote Safer Internet Day in Scotland as well. So that's me.
Brilliant. I was allowed to unmute. Thank you. Yeah, the host is keeping everybody muted so we can all hear each other, and I was muted as well. So apologies for that. Liz, can I pass across to you just a bit about your role and your bit around misinformation as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me today. We're really pleased to be here. Misinformation is obviously a really important area for us. So in my role, it's a government relations role, which is relationships with government. So I act as a liaison for the company with governments in the UK and Ireland and elsewhere. And I think my role is really to help keep abreast of what governments are concerned about with regard to misinformation. We talk to members of parliament across the country about what they're thinking about, what they're seeing on the platform. And really we work to educate them about what we're doing. Another element that our team works on, which is, we think, pretty exciting, is something called Project Halo. It's a Team Halo, which is a collection of doctors from around the world that create videos that are really focused on spreading factual information about the vaccine and countering misinformation. I think about 300 million videos have been created as part of this Team Halo effort. We did a live stream with the Mayor of London, with one of the doctors from the project. They really addressed in detail concerns around COVID misinformation. So that's my role in a very short nutshell.
Thank you, Liz. Apologies about the muting there. That's fascinating, and I think for colleagues who are listening, I think one of the things that we will try and do is share some of the URLs, because I think it would be fascinating to be able to look in a bit more detail at that Project Halo, that Team Halo as well. Thanks, Liz. Al, over to you.
Thanks very much. So yeah, my name's Al. I'm the managing editor at Logically. Logically is a tech company which exists to develop products, technology, other systems, carry out research, all concerned with combating, understanding, and figuring out how to, accurately identify and map misinformation. And we have done a lot of work over the last year in particular. It was a very busy year to be in this particular industry. So we've done an awful lot of work on COVID misinformation. We did some work on supporting a key swing state in the US elections. And we also work with several other public and private sector partners, including at the moment TikTok. My particular role in Logically is to oversee all of the editorial outputs, and that includes all of our fact-checking, our journalism, and our investigations and investigations-led research. So this is where we might be commissioned to look at a particular misinformation trend or misinformation in a particular part of the world, or our own independent research. We did a lot of work on helping kind of the wider research community to understand QAnon over the last year, and we successfully had quite a good degree of real world impact in pursuing that as well, which was very satisfying. So yeah, that's a broad outline of my role.
Thanks, Al. That's really helpful. And it's interesting that you mentioned COVID and the presidential election and all of that, because I think that that's perhaps why a lot of us are, much more aware perhaps of misinformation at the current time. And Jess, one of the things that I think a lot of people struggle with, or perhaps it's just me, is that, there are different terms, aren't there? We hear a lot about fake news, thanks to President Trump, perhaps, who constantly was talking about it. But we also hear about misinformation and disinformation. And I just wondered if you can kind of perhaps clarify the difference between those for us, just to get that clear at the start.
Sure. And we can't shake off fake news, can we? It just sticks.
Quite, yeah.
That terminology, we've said it several times already. So yeah, there was a problem with the term fake news. Main problem actually was that it suggested that that there's a binary aspect to it. Something's either true or false, and that just it isn't the case. So that was kind of one problem with fake news. And the other problem with it was, as a term, it started to be used to mean something slightly different, as in, actually, that's something I don't like, rather than being fake. So so that kind of term's fallen out of favor, and now we have misinformation and disinformation. So what do they all mean? And I think it's probably a moving feast anyway. But misinformation, I kind of see that used in two ways. Sometimes it's used as that kind of general broad term in terms of any kind of false information, but more specifically when you're kind of working in this space, misinformation is referencing false information, but information that's shared without any intent to harm. So I always think of things like April Fools, right? In fact, there's a photograph I've got, I think is it Panorama back in the 1950s that did the spaghetti growing on trees? It's not new, this stuff.
I'm too young to know, but yes.
Well, me too, obviously.
Of course, yeah.
So that's the idea of misinformation is false information, which for whatever reason it's false, but it's not intended to deceive or cause harm. And then we say disinformation is also false information, but there's real intent. So that might be political, it might be financial. So things like scams would count potentially as disinformation as well, or anything else that's where somebody's trying to achieve a goal that's a harmful type goal. So that's my kind of understanding. That's how I use it. But I suspect that the terminology is going to keep changing.
I think that's really helpful, Jess. Thank you. And I think, so mis shared without malice or malicious intent, dis perhaps shared in order to purposely mislead. And I think you're right that, it's a movable feast. And Ofcom, I spotted, published a discussion paper at the end of last month, and it was all about understanding online false information, which I thought was interesting. And they talk about a couple of definitions, and what colleagues will be interested or possibly not surprised to hear is that even across different government departments, they can't agree on the definitions. So, where do we go from there? But I think that's really helpful for us today. And Al, in terms of misinformation, how big a deal is it? Is it something that we should be really worried about? What are the issues that it can cause?
I mean, that's the $1 million question, and I think it interestingly relates to the discussion around what exactly we mean by misinformation, right? Because the degree to which you think misinformation is a problem depends on what you understand misinformation to be, and thereby what you understand it to be responsible for. So last year obviously dramatized a lot of the ways that misinformation can obviously be harmful. People certainly died, probably hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe more of people died directly because of misinformation trends during global pandemic. People certainly died because of misinformation around the 2020 election and the results and the fallout from that. So there's, it shouldn't be there shouldn't be any doubt in anybody's mind that misinformation is an enormous problem and is a serious threat to an enormous variety of elements in the, crucial to have any kind of well-functioning society. But the point around what misinformation is, I think, is really pressing, because there is a sense that one of the problems that I think we encounter when we're doing work in an effort to combat misinformation is a sense of skepticism from people who feel like we are kind of pushing back against their legitimate political interests. And one of the reasons why that response is so kind of available to people is that everyone's still a little bit fluffy and fuzzy on what exactly misinformation means and what we think is wrong with it. So yes, we usually define it in terms of false information, but the biggest problem in terms of the way misinformation is creating kind of uncertainty and confusion in areas where it perhaps shouldn't, isn't that people are sharing things which are like definitely false and then believing them. It's the bigger threat is that people are sharing things which are badly contextualized, poorly understood, or otherwise used to support harmful narratives. So it's, in my view, it's the narrative which ought to be the locus of our attention rather than the truth or falsehood of the facts themselves. And sorry, to get back to the actual question, if we understand misinformation in narrative terms, and the question is like, how much of a threat are problematic narratives? I mean, it just becomes a much more difficult question to answer, and one that I don't think we've really begun to address in a sufficiently sophisticated way.
I think that's fascinating, and I think what you were sort of talking about there about, I hear a lot of people in schools saying, there's a huge problem with this. Let's just teach children to be able to spot, this type of, but it's never as clear cut. Well, I mean, perhaps sometimes it is, but it's there's going to be a lot of stuff in that middle area that's kind of not completely false, but equally not completely true. And I guess I like what you're saying about the narrative being really important around that.
And it's also, I mean, I find it very helpful in designing like fact-checking processes logically. I find it very helpful to focus rather than on truth and falsehood, on reasonableness and unreasonableness. So like, given a shared set of facts and a verifiable set of facts, the real question is not like what is true and what is false, but what conclusions is it reasonable to draw from these facts? So like we see this all the time in the, sorry, keep bringing things back to COVID, but in poor science communication results not in people disagreeing over the facts per se, but disagreeing about how significant those facts are. So for instance, when you see stories shared of like people having side effects from a vaccine, the issue is not that those things are true. It's fine. The problem is that people see that as a reason to be suspicious of the vaccine.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think what you said at the beginning as well about when I asked you, how big a problem is it, and you said, well, people have lost their lives. I mean, I think that's quite sobering actually, and really important to state and to be clear about. Liz, I think before we get to the misinformation piece, I'm sure a lot of people are very familiar with TikTok and what TikTok is and how it works, but we did have quite a few questions in the sort of registration process where people were quite keen just to sort of find out a little bit more about, moderation and things like that. So I wonder if you can perhaps just say a little bit about the platform and how it works and so on.
Sure, of course. TikTok is a short form of a video platform that I think, as you say, most people are now familiar with. During the pandemic, a lot of people turned to TikTok for moments of joy and connecting with family in different parts of the world or parts of the country. In terms of the way in which we safeguard our users, I mean, I could talk about this for quite some time, so I'll try and keep it short, but it's really kind of three different ways. We have, like other platforms, community guidelines that are effectively our rule book or guardrails about what is allowed and what is not allowed on TikTok. So we don't allow, for example, misinformation about COVID that is a threat to life or causes real world harm. So in addition to our community guidelines, we have a bunch of safety features that we have put in place for our users across the platform. We have particular protections in place for our under 16s. About 2 weeks ago, we launched, for example, a new feature turning under 16 accounts private by default. Our users who are 16 and under are not allowed to send a direct message. They're not allowed to live stream. So we have a range of features for younger people. And I think another important part of our approach to the way in which we draft our community guidelines is that we engage regularly with NGOs. So we talk to NGOs from different communities, whether it be around preventing eating disorder content or NGOs dealing in the space of misinformation. We talk to those NGOs to make sure that we're most aware of different conspiracy theories. I would say relevant to this conversation, we also have brought on board a whole range of fact checkers, including Logically, to look at our content and help advise us on some of the video content that we may not be able to check the veracity of ourselves. So it's a combination of internal processes complemented by partnerships with external partners fact checkers, NGOs, etc. I think that hopefully that answers the question, but happy to go further on any of those.
Thank you, Liz. No, I think it does. And I think it's great that you referenced some of those really quite significant changes that the platform made, not just the ones earlier this year, but actually last year as well. There were some really important safety things put in place. And I would urge people to go and find out more about them. I think it's often very quick to sort of make judgments about a social media platform, but actually go and have a look at those community guidelines. I think Jess can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the UK Safer Internet Centre have some guidance again around the platform and things that parents can do.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
There's a checklist.
Yeah, and I guess we can share all of this afterwards somehow. I'm not quite sure how we'll do it, folks who are watching, but we will find a way to do that and make it available. And Liz, if I can just stick with you and come to the sort of misinformation bit now, I think a lot of social media platforms are being sort of much more accountable, I guess, for what they do. And I noticed that TikTok, like many of them, have released their transparency reports, and helpfully one was released yesterday. And I think what it shows is, that misinformation is not the greatest challenge for the platform. I think you removed about 89 million videos in the second half of last year, and 2% of those. So it's not small numbers, but 2% were related to integrity and authenticity. And I just wondered, as you've done this sort of work over time, has that changed at all? We're hearing a lot more about misinformation at the moment, but has it actually become a bigger issue for you to deal with at TikTok?
Yeah, I mean, you are right that we did release the transparency report yesterday, and I think we have, as a platform, have seen that misinformation has not been a big problem for us. In the last half of last year, we removed a total of 55,000 videos on TikTok, which is a very small number compared to the volume of videos that we put out every day on the platform. But we, I think, even though it's not really a massive problem for us, we are remaining diligent and not resting on our laurels in terms of what we're doing. So we are introducing new things, like another feature we introduced, which is called Know the Facts, which is a feature that allows us to put a label on videos, to label the videos to say this video contains unverified information. And we did that as a way to offer an opportunity for our users to pause before they share the information. If the video is shared, that the unverified information tag stays on the video. And we've done that, and we've seen that 1 in 4 people don't share that video because they think, what's the point of sharing a video that has unverified information? So we launched that feature in the UK and Ireland, in fact, just yesterday, actually the 24th of February. So we'll see how it plays out, but it's had great success. We've tested it in different markets, and it's something that we think we need to do more of, those kind of nudges or efforts to change behavior and get people to really stop before they just share information and try to be, we want people to be a bit more critical about the way that they engage with our content. So in summary, really, just to say that misinformation, as you said, is not a big problem on the platform, but we think we're doing a lot of really great things to prevent it from becoming a problem, but we're always trying to evolve to get better in the space.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. That's great. I mean, you heard it here first, and it's great to have the evidence behind all of that as well, that it actually does make a difference. Because I think the problem with any user-generated content is, that it's about behavior ultimately, isn't it? About people making the right choices. I mean, Al, we talk about fact-checking a lot, and what does it actually mean? I mean, I'm speaking from a total novice's, point of view here, but is it a mixture of technical and human solutions? How does it actually work, if it's possible to answer that sort of succinctly?
No, it's very possible. So it's really interesting, right? So so fact checking as a journalistic institution is relatively new. There's been a newsroom role for as long as there have been newsrooms where there's somebody called a fact checker who will get a story which is about to be published, go through it, and just make sure that anything that could be challenged in a court is in fact true. So it's just a lot of phoning up, making sure everything's right. And then that role has kind of grown, particularly since in the mid-90s. Mostly mid-90s, we had organizations like Snopes start up. And then over the last few years, the institutions become more and more prominent. Washington Post and their fact-checking unit in particular has brought the kind of practice to prominence. But what's really interesting is that because the practice grew out of that kind of really basic newsroom role, what the fact-checking community is in a lot of ways still trying to use the tools of a very kind of basic newsroom functionality to address a much more significant problem than maybe it was ever intended to. So the reason I bring this up is that what fact checking is now is actually a lot less, has a lot less in common with merely establishing whether certain things are true or false, and a lot more with trying to develop ways to help the public at large, and maybe other stakeholders as well, interpret facts in a way which is like helpful to them understanding the political world, right? So this is why non-partisanship is very, very important in fact-checking operations, because what you have to be careful about is to be neutral in the way that you're recommending the interpretation of a particular fact, right? So we say that this claim, you know, it's often things are just like straightforwardly true and it's fine and there's no problem with interpretation. Similarly, often things are straightforwardly false. And in terms of the workflow, it's just pretty much what you would imagine, right? We have sources that we know we can rely on. We go and check those sources against the information. We have technology and tools as well that can help us source evidence and information very quickly and very reliably. And that's largely what our kind of tech, where our tech comes into play. The fact checking in the end is almost always done by a person, unless it's something that the machine is very, very confident that they can make a good decision on. Yes, so that's what it. We have this process, which is we have a process whereby we get evidence, we label certain judgments, we have review processes, corrections processes, all of which is just in the service of trying to present for our users and our readers and our clients information in the most helpful way possible.
Thank you. It's interesting to me to hear that actually the end bit is often done by a human being, which I guess probably reassures people to some extent. But equally, perhaps, you know, some people will say, well, you mentioned this, Al, a little bit about bias, but you know, do you have some safeguards in there? You know, so if you're working with TikTok, how can TikTok be sure that, you know, it is completely, you know, unbiased, I suppose?
Sure. I mean, it's a real concern, and it's a good thing to be concerned about, and it's the thing that most people, you know, take issue at us for, is perceived bias. But really, the easiest way to try and prevent bias in any organization, and particularly in fact checking, is to firstly acknowledge that that there will be biases in the individual members of your team, and secondly, to build structures to mitigate those. So ours involve, like, the easiest thing you can do to eliminate bias in a fact-checking process is to have it go through as many different people as possible. You can introduce something that technology can help with, is you can introduce elements of randomness, which really helps. So we can have, so rather than having our fact checkers decide what they're going to look for or check, we have them, the work that they're going to do assigned by a semi-automated system. And it's just, yeah, the risk of bias decreases by orders of magnitude the more people and the more diverse people that you have looking at the doing the work. So that's the main thing that we do. The other way you reduce the risk of bias, or at least reduce the risk of bias having an impact, is just to have a really good, clear corrections policy and a really transparent and accountable corrections policy. People can go on our website and see all the mistakes we've made, and anyone can, you know, comment on anything that we do, and we will always look at it.
Great, thank you. I think that's very reassuring, actually, to know that, you know, that there's such transparency. And I think that there's been a lot of research, you know, coming out just recently. I mean, you know, of course there would be, around all of this. And it seems to, as research would, you know, sort of contradict itself sometimes. I read one piece that King's College did, and it was very much focused just on vaccine misinformation, COVID vaccine misinformation. And what it suggested is that, you know, most people wouldn't believe, you know, the misinformation, but a notable minority, it said a notable minority would, and it said that actually they would tend to be younger people and those who are using social media, which is of great interest to me because of the work that I do in schools. And Jess, I don't know if I can come to you first, but, you know, do we have a notion of who is most affected by misinformation? Because I've equally read other bits that say, actually, no, it's older people who are going to be more affected. And I just don't know if you have a view on that.
Oh, it's the older ones. No, I don't know. We don't know. There's so much research. There's so much research, but there was the one that I really liked was published back in 2019. And that was a research that was done of American Facebook users. And what they discovered was that over 65s were 7 times more likely to share misinformation on Facebook than the under 30s. So that was a little win for the young'uns. But yeah, I've seen loads of research. There's research that shows that younger people are more likely to see misinformation. They're more likely to visit misinformation websites. They're more likely to believe virus misinformation. But I noticed Ofcom's got some research out just recently as well, of looking at the breakdown along ethnicity lines as well. So some concerns perhaps coming out there about ethnic minority groups and people being more or less likely to feel that they might be exposed to misinformation and how they might respond to that, where they go for trusted sources of information. It feels to me like it's a really huge issue, and like so many aspects of online harms, it's changing all the time and we haven't really got a full picture of what's going on.
Thanks, Jess. Al, did you want to jump in? Have you got any thoughts on, who's most likely to be affected?
Always. I think Jess's main point is absolutely right, that we just don't have a clear enough picture yet of what's going on. One of the huge problems is that a huge amount of misinformation, and again, this is kind of anecdotal of necessity, but a huge amount of misinformation, particularly in BAME communities, goes through closed channels, so not open networks, not Facebook, not Twitter, not anything that we can monitor. They're private WhatsApp groups for the most part. So just these are real structural barriers to getting a clear idea of what's going on. We are actually working on some research trying to understand this a little bit better. On the point of the other research, there's something I wanted to flag, which I think is really interesting. And just to bring us back to the first definitional point, there's often an issue in those kinds of research that the research which tries to understand how prevalent this information is that a lot of the time the questions that they ask, that people kind of assent to as an indication that they are susceptible to misinformation, are not clearly, like, it's very often very easy to see how someone who is not unreasonable might assent or might give their assent to one of these things. So in the King study, I was interested to read that the thing that the response that was really driving the spike amongst young people was the claim that pharmaceutical companies are mainly interested in developing the vaccine for profit purposes, right? So it certainly plays into some conspiracy narratives and some misinformation narratives, but is that belief in itself evidence of conspiracy thinking? Or is it evidence that a lot of teenagers maybe have slightly reflexive, maybe unreflective, maybe unsophisticated politics? And is that a problem, right? So one of the huge challenges we face in understanding the scale of the problem is that clearly a lot of the things that we're worried about were issues before social media kind of changed the entire way that we communicate with one another. People had unsophisticated politics before then, people were abusive to one another before then, people did all these things. So I think it's really important to anyone who's minded to kind of try and understand this issue to get as clear as possible on what is a new problem, what's been exacerbated by the changes in our media landscape, and what has kind of just always been a problem. And we're just noticing it now because it seems so much more concentrated and easily visible, perhaps.
It's fascinating. And I think as ever, more research is needed. We need to understand more about this. I mean, so Liz, there's the partnership with Logically to sort of help identify content which could be misleading and so on. Can you say a little bit about how that kind of works in reality, and maybe talk to us a little bit about anything else that you do to address this sort of thing? I mean, I know you've mentioned the sort of labeling, which I think is really important and clearly very recent.
Definitely. So I think I'll talk about that in two parts, just on Logically, the partnership with Logically and other fact checkers around the globe. We have a whole set of thousands and thousands of moderators based throughout different parts of the world, and they will look at a video. And if we are not able to look at our community guidelines and identify whether or not something is factual according to the moderator, we'll send that video to one of our fact-checking partners, including Logically, who then send us back their view on the particular video. But ultimately, we take the decision about what we do on that actual video based on the advice from the fact checker. But you mentioned just now the labeling. We have a COVID hub, which has been seen 2.6 billion times by people around the globe. First it was COVID information, now it's a vaccine hub, and we label videos. And I've got a whole range of statistics here I could give you about how many millions and millions of times people have have looked at these COVID hubs, but also looked at the public service announcement we have. So our real aim is to, on the back end, make sure that the videos that we're sharing are factual information, that we're taking down those videos that have misinformation. But then on the kind of more forward proactive way of redirecting our users to factual information, we use the labeling. When videos have coronavirus, we'll label them and refer people to this factual information and the hubs. So it has been effective, as you hear. The 2.6 billion users globally have visited this hub over the past 10-month period. So I think it is working. People are engaging with the content, and we'll keep on doing, keep on improving it until we no longer are necessarily all very interested in COVID misinformation. But I would just to add too on the U.S. election, which Al mentioned, we did a similar initiative in the U.S. with the election. We had a hub there with factual information. And if people posted misinformation about the election with a false voting date, that was obviously misinformation. We also blocked certain hashtags that would share potentially erroneous information. For example, if you go on a TikTok and look for "Stop the Steal," you won't get any content. So those are the kind of things that we've done both on the COVID misinformation, but more broadly on misinformation with regard to elections. So it's a pretty holistic approach, we think.
Thank you, Liz. That's really interesting and really helpful to sort of get a little bit more insight into how it works. We've had a question, which I'm going to put out to all three of you, actually, from one of our colleagues in the audience. And they're saying, how does the panel feel about personal data being misused or abused in order to allow organizations to target particular demographics with misinformation and disinformation? So I wonder who'd like to sort of have a stab at that one.
It's a tricky one. Shall I start?
Please, Jess. Yeah, go on.
Do you know, I suppose it's just we had this kind of revelation, didn't we? And personal data has just become so much of a focus now. People are so concerned about their data and their privacy. And essentially what the question is asking is about the fact that structurally, the way things are set up at the moment, the idea that you get free access to content, free access to services in exchange for your data is problematic. And I think that's where we're sitting at right now. It is, there's no doubt it's problematic, causes a range of issues because of our data being taken and need to keep on screen. I think what's interesting here, though, is that when we were talking about misinformation, I didn't mention, for example, I don't know, touching up photos, right? So some of you, some people when they're on Zoom, they'll have done the little wee slider as to how beautified I want to look while I'm on screen. Is that misinformation or advertising? Is that misinformation? Is it okay as long as we know it's an advert? So this is quite complex, and I think we need to recognize that what's happened is we've taken a lot of business type approaches. So things like trying to get a lot of followers, right? Trying to get a lot of likes. These are business type metrics, and what's happened is that we've adopted those into our kind of personal social interactions online. So this is quite complex, but of course, totally disagree. Nobody wants their data to be taken and misused without understanding it. But from my perspective, there's a really I suppose, final point to say here, and I suppose it's because I'm thinking of this in terms of education. We can do all the kind of media literacy education in the world, and that's amazing, but it's only going to work if the system is understandable. And so a very simple example of that would be terms and conditions, right? I can teach some 15-year-olds all about kind of, media literacy, but at the end of the day, if they can't actually read the terms and conditions because they're written in such a verbose manner, then all of that education kind of flies out the window. So there are some big questions here structurally.
Yeah. Liz or Al want to come in on that? I think it's a fascinating but challenging one.
Yeah, I think the structural issue is the right one, right? We need to, and there's two really interesting things I think Jess brought up. The first is the issue over like what should constitute misinformation. Again, it seems like we just haven't been able to have a clear discussion in this country, at least, about what the norms governing social media discourse should be. So I know we had a question about abuse and like cyberbullying and so on. It's really remarkable when you try and take a look at this problem. It's remarkable the range of things that people consider acceptable or unacceptable. And then all the people do is talk in terms of abuse, but when people fundamentally aren't agreed, there's no common understanding of what constitutes abuse, who deserves it, who doesn't, who might be exempt from any protections, like what degree of public figure-ness do you have to reach before you should just expect a little bit of abuse as a part of your, like, at what point, like what should we expect people to have a thick skin to, and what shouldn't we? We just haven't had these conversations. And I think to delegate that responsibility to social media platforms is, I think, not entirely healthy. I mean, I'm sure they should have a view. The private sector should absolutely have a view on what is appropriate, what's popular, what's enforceable, but we shouldn't expect the tech sector or the social media or any element of the private sector to be the arbiters of what is considered acceptable speech in a public sphere or what's considered misinformation. That's a conversation that we need to have, I guess, as a society, right?
Yeah. I guess that's perhaps what the online harms white paper and the legislation is going to try to sort of put a bit more clarity around. But there's then a big question as to whether that's the right sort of way to address it as well, really.
So, I mean, my concern about the white paper, or the big thing that I think was missed out of the white paper, is very large. So you can understand why, right? It's very largely focused on physical harm or a measurable harm, because this is the way that governments like to work in the modern day. Like, we need to have metrics, we need to have things that we need to design policy with an eye to understanding whether it's effective or not. So we need to design policy that we can easily measure the outcomes associated with, and hence the focus on harm, right? So we're interested in, like, how many cases of fraud, how much child can we avoid, how much child sexual abuse can we avoid, all those kinds of things. Whereas, like, clearly one of the really insidious parts of the misinformation problem is that it is just changing the way our public sphere operates in a way that I think no one has really got to grips with yet. And there wasn't really room in the white paper. The thing I'm worried about is that there won't be room in these policy discussions for discussion about, like, the wider, more significant changes to just the way that to the way that the public sphere operates, which we're now kind of in the middle of, with no real understanding of how it's going to work.
Wow, I just find this fascinating. I mean, I think, you know, what's clear is that, you know, everybody has to sort of wake up and, you know, play their part in all of this. And I wonder, I mean, Jess, you know, who do you think needs to sort of take the lead in sort of, you know, looking after this and addressing it and tackling it? I mean, is it schools? Is it regulators? Is it policymakers? You know, where do we start? Because, you know, again, I said at the beginning, I do a lot of work in schools, and, you know, we have these checklists and great big long checklists saying this is how you identify, you know, misinformation or what have you. But, you know, does it work? You know, or actually do we just look at something and make a split-second decision? What do you reckon? I mean, where do we start?
All of the above. Right. I mean, you know, with that question, you know, that it's all of the above, it's everybody. So do we know if the education works? No, not really. Do we know that we operate on an emotional level when we respond to online content? Yes. I think lots of different aspects to this. If you're looking at education, then we've got great stuff out there, practical tips. You know, you can do things like reverse image search and all this kind of thing. And that's fantastic. But I mean, it's actually something Al mentioned right at the beginning. He talked about this narrative idea. We need to get away from this idea that online content is one single piece of information and that our job, you know, is to respond and decide whether that's true or not. We need to actually be thinking about operating within this whole ecosystem and understanding, actually, why do I see that bit of information? You know, what's the pattern here of what I'm seeing? So is that something that I'm seeing in my newsfeed that's being pushed out to me, and why? Have I been profiled in a certain way? Or is it my connections, the people that I'm connected with, right? It's almost this idea that search changed. We used to search for information and now it searches for us. And so there's a whole aspect to this about actually understanding the information that we are surrounded by and being much more conscious about that. So that, again, does come down to some practical things like, you know, pruning who you're engaged with, thinking actually about who you're following, who's influencing you. So from an educational perspective, lots of things to think about. And I think we need to really integrate a lot of this across across, curriculum, across other pieces of work that we're doing. We can't treat a lot of these online safety issues as standalone. They're not standalone anymore. They are part and parcel of how we live our lives. In terms of your question about who should take responsibility, clearly it's all of us. I think what's really important is to recognize what influence you have. So if you're a teacher, you're influential, right? Maybe you're somebody who's successful in business. Maybe you're a community leader, right? Actually, we all have a sense of power and influence. So wield that carefully would be probably my suggestion. Oh, and as part of that, people that work in technology, these structural issues. So whether you are a software developer or you're somebody that's sitting on the board of a tech company, be mindful, conscious about how these technologies that you're creating, how they work. The really interesting area that I've kind of getting more interested in now is this idea of how we create inclusive communities, because we do respond as humans, we respond to how technology is designed, and it can be designed in ways that's inclusive and nudges people towards positive behaviors, and it can do the opposite as well. So there's lots to think about.
Thank you, Jess. And I think, involving young people in some of that as well is crucial, because one of the things that we do as part of the InSafe network, we have a sort of BIC youth panel, a Better Internet for Kids youth panel. And a year ago on Safer Internet Day in 2020, they set up this BIC youth pledge, and they've been actually working with a lot of the tech companies. Liz will be aware of this, to sort of look at things like terms and conditions, that clearly nobody reads or very few people read, and saying, can we have these written in a way that we can all understand it, and so we know what's happening to our data and so on. And the other one that just occurred to me, Jess, while you were talking, a sort of statement from YouTube a little while ago, where they said that 70% of all of their videos that were watched were recommendations from the platform. Unbelievable. And of course, the video that's up next, it's normally something I'm vaguely interested in because the algorithm knows a lot about me, but you can very quickly just be sort of bombarded with the same content and not be getting that sort of balance, I guess. We've got another question, colleagues on the panel, which is an interesting one, and perhaps Liz can have a go at this. It says, curious about the thought that people are indifferent to their data privacy. We often hear people saying, oh, well, I don't care if Google or Facebook or whoever know all this stuff about me. That's something we often hear, but does that perhaps lead to more effective targeting by misinformation campaigns? And the question sort of says, particularly amongst TikTok users who we know perhaps are some of the younger teens and so on. I don't know whether you can have a stab at that one, Liz.
Yeah. Well, first I'd say we of course care about our user data, and we put out a policy last year that was a simplified under 18 privacy policy that goes to the point of these policies being unreadable. So we've tried to address that by creating a policy that is, we think, readable. And we do loads of, we take into consideration data as the highest priority with regard to our users, protecting our users' data. We don't, it's not really necessarily a question that I have thought about, because we don't use our users' data to promote false information. Our goal is to keep that information off the platform. You referenced our transparency report, and we took 92% of the content we took down was taken down before anyone even saw it. So it's not something that I have a really great answer on, unfortunately, because it's just not something I have a lot of experience in with regard to the way in which data would target a misinformation campaign, because we're just not interested in having that type of content on the platform. I don't know if Al maybe has a better answer than that, but that's kind of all I can really say on it.
I don't think so. I mean, the question, this kind of goes back to the structural issues, and I guess one point that is worth raising at this point is that it's important to take a platform-specific approach to all of these questions. So the way that you get, so I think your point about YouTube is very well taken, Carl. So just the way that YouTube works, the way that YouTube's recommendation algorithm works is of necessity very different to the way that TikTok's works. And that's not for any nefarious reasons. It's just because of the designs are different, the platform designs are different. And so the problems that go hand in hand with each platform design is going to be different as well. So I think need to, as well as being, I think there are some across the board recommendations which are very good. I love the idea of having a clearer idea of the precise way that my data is used, as clear a possible idea. This is something I don't know. I don't know how much of a legitimate black box recommender systems are. I don't know how explainable in principle any of the appearance of certain information in my feed is. Even that's probably something to look at too. But I think it's important to just bear in mind that the problems with misinformation on YouTube are going to be very different to the problems with misinformation on Twitter, on WhatsApp, and on Instagram, if only because they're appearing in different media and there are different design elements and different communities. So I think we should be also wary of kind of across the board solutions, or anything that sounds like it's going to work for every platform probably isn't.
Really interesting. I mean, and I guess looking to the future, you know, clearly this is a problem that is here to stay, and we have to get better at it from all different sort of standpoints. But I mean, you know, tech is clearly going to play a role in sort of, you know, dealing with misinformation. Liz, you mentioned, did you say 92% of content is harmful content is removed before anybody sees it, I think you said, which is astonishing and to be applauded. But, you know, where do we go from here? Can it get better? You know, can machine learning or, you know, algorithms, you know, improve even more? I don't know if...
We're always looking to train our machine learning models so that they get smarter and smarter at acknowledging this or finding this information. We use keywords. We partner with different organizations that can help us get better and better at detecting this kind of content. So yeah, we can always improve. I mean, you mentioned earlier our journey on safety, and you know, because we've known each other for a while, that over the past year and a half we've made quite significant changes in that space, and we're looking at new things we can be doing. So I mean, I guess it's sort of a situation, of course I would say that, but we do think that we're doing a good job now, but we can always do better.
That's great to hear though, Liz, thank you. And Al, did you have anything to throw in on that?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing that technology can do, the thing that machine learning models can do, which is really important, is that they can do things very quickly and very scalably, right? So if we get the right model trained in the right way, then theoretically it can, no matter how much misinformation is out there, it can find it and deal with it in the ways that we decided are appropriate. The problem with technology, the problem with machine learning, and just to toot my own company's horn a little bit, the reason why we in particular are so keen to always keep humans as a part of the workflow is that, again, goes back to this definition point, right? If we need to train a machine learning model to spot misinformation, we need to tell it very, very clearly what misinformation is. We need to make it really easy for a computer to understand what constitutes misinformation and what doesn't. Usually the way that like very often the way that works is by associating keywords with it, and it works a lot of the time, but it's not a particularly sophisticated way of understanding what misinformation is. It gives you with a reasonable degree of confidence, you can identify something that's likely to be misinformation, but that's not going to be the end of it. There's going to be a really long way that we have to go before we're developing machine learning models which identify misinformation with the same kind of intuitive results as that which a person could do. So yeah, I guess the takeaway here is that technology is absolutely going to be part of the solution, because it is scalable, because it is quick. The thing that we can't expect technology to do is have the conversation for us about what misinformation is and what we should be targeting.
That's so clear. That's really helpful. Thank you, Al. We're almost out of time. I was going to just quickly open this to the floor, and we've just had a question that's come in, which I think is fascinating, actually. The question says, does blocking those who share misinformation or disinformation actually just, serve to marginalize them further, because actually they may be victims themselves? Jess, I don't know whether you've got a thought on that one.
Oh, yes. My quick answer. Oh, wow. Do you know what? The last few minutes, there's so much that's been going into my head. When we think about, there's two aspects here, I think, right? There's the technology design. We've talked about things like algorithms. We've talked about the kind of frictionless design and how it might take us down a certain rabbit hole. And then there's our brain, right? We like stuff that's familiar. We like stuff that's easy to process. There's a reason why, we tend to share or comment on certain types of content and others. And so I think we need to look at this this whole issue from kind of both of those sides. But the other side that's been mentioned here as well is, of course, the social angle as well. So what's happening to people that are sharing misinformation or disinformation? And again, if we think back to the education piece, because that's the bit that I'm kind of most involved in, if we were thinking about everything that we need to learn about media literacy, then a big part of that has to be how you engage with somebody that's got alternative viewpoints.
Yeah.
And what we're actually seeing happening online at the moment is the opposite, right? We're seeing lots of shutting down and inability to engage. So there's some really crucial skills here, which are beyond anything to do with kind of fact checking. They are about how to disagree with somebody. They are about how to have a conversation, show some empathy. They are about really thinking about motivations, values. You know, the brain is amazing. We can protect ourselves. So if we have a certain belief, we'll do everything we can to protect it. We're fabulous at rationalizing, right? So this isn't about facts. There's a whole other stuff going on as to why people have certain perspectives. So yes, of course, people can be victims. I think with technology, we sometimes jump to the idea that we can solve something through tech. Block, report, that'll solve it.
Yeah.
That's not going to solve it.
Doesn't address the nub of the issue quite often, does it? Yeah. Thank you, Jess. Liz or Al?
I think it's worth thinking in response to that. It's an excellent question, but I think it's worth thinking what precisely the problem is that we're trying to solve when we do the blocking, the banning, and so on. Because one, like, it's perfectly reasonable, for instance, to want to live on a social media platform and not encounter like crap. That I don't. I'm going to block people. I'm not going to follow. Like, I have different account. I have a YouTube account, which is my Dross account, right? Because I need to keep an eye on what's going on there, and I have. But like my regular account, I will go to the ends of the earth to avoid having stuff crop up that I just don't want to engage with. And I think that's a reasonable thing to want. So on the one hand, we have like users' rights to kind of not be overly bothered by having to engage with stuff that's just going to be irritating. The bigger problem is that, and then there's the problem of like, how do we, I guess it's something like, how do we fix these people who have like wildly odd beliefs which are maybe dangerous? And there's a question about like, so what we've seen in the wake of the Capitol building riots on January 6th, there was a huge platform ban on Twitter. We saw a huge migration of people away from mainstream platforms and onto these smaller platforms, and these smaller platforms are now like appalling siloed echo chambers of like hatefulness and dreadfulness. And then, so the question is like, the question then becomes, do we need to be concerned about those people? Do we need to be concerned that that's happening, or can we be satisfied that that's just being pushed off into the fringes? And again, I think that's a big discussion that we need to have, and it's about like it's just about how, I guess, pure we need the public sphere to be in all of its areas. Like, do we need to care if there is a dark corner of the internet somewhere, or maybe only if it's dangerous? But how do we tell if it's dangerous? These are all huge open questions, and yeah.
It's are we just papering over the cracks and not addressing the much greater challenge there? Yeah. Wow. We're almost out of time, colleagues. Thank you so much for all the questions that we've had, and a huge thank you to the panelists that are not quite finished yet. I want to give them one chance to just make one final comment, and I'm going to ask them to be really brief. But, you know, misinformation is obviously here to stay. If you were to suggest one thing that we as individuals could do or should do to address the problem, what would it be? Liz, do you want to go first? One thing that we should do.
Yes, it's kind of like, don't judge a book by its cover. Don't believe everything you read or see, or, you know, and if you do see something that's not believable or you're concerned about, report it.
Great, thank you. Oh, sorry.
Critical thinker, I guess, is really what I'm.
Yeah, really helpful. Thank you. Jess?
I think, you know, recognize that you are a supplier, not a customer in the technology ecosystem. We are the fake news, right? It comes from us. We share, we create. So just curate your online world. It's the thing I said earlier, right? Think about who you're following, what content you're giving out, what kind of agreements you've got to use your data, and where you spend your time. Is this a good space or not? Is it a trustworthy space? But what you don't want to do is get into the position where you're creating your own truth. that's where things, we're starting to get parallel universes. That's
so we mustn't be passive users. We need to be active in terms of what we engage with.
Active. And I think we need to be focusing on, shared truth is important, right? Really important. So
brilliant. Thank you, Jess. And Al, final word.
One thing that people can do, I guess resist the temptation to think that there is an easy answer. So that if only platforms would do this, if only government would do that, if only other people would do this, that's the especially pernicious one, right? I guess just be prepared for this to be a problem for a long time, and start thinking very carefully about what you want the long-term future of information sharing to look like, because that's where we are. We need to decide that now.
Wow. Thank you so much. I think that's a great way to sort of draw things to a close. It's been a fascinating discussion. I've certainly learned a huge amount, and huge thanks to our three experts, for sharing their wisdom and their knowledge, and huge thanks to the people who've joined, in a busy day of Zoom calls probably. Thank you for making the time to be here, and thanks also to the technical team behind the scenes who sort of made it all work. Please do visit saferinternet.org.uk for more information about a lot of the things that we've discussed, and there's more events, by the way, I think in Cyber Scotland Week that you can sort of get involved with and take part in, but for now, thank you for taking part. We will share the recording somehow, and more links and things that I hope will be useful. But thanks everybody, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you very much, Carl. Excellently chaired.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carl.